thank you very much for joining us here in the pavilion for our panel on a collaborative approach to preventing a pre-antibiotic future. For those of you who've been dropping by off and on over the last couple of days, you probably know that a big theme here in the Mass Pavilion has been collaboration and partnership. I think this is a very, very interesting topic to continue that discussion. In the spirit of leaving some time for real interaction with you, your questions and discussion, we're going to keep introductory comments very short, and we're going to keep introductions of the panelists short, so I apologize in advance if I'm not giving you a flavor for the great talent that is sitting up here with me, and I certainly thank all of them for joining me. We're going to hear three different thought leaders in scientific and clinical roles, and I'm going to start by inviting each of them to give us their insight on the challenges of developing and discovering treatments within this field, and even what the future could look like, and more importantly, what are the opportunities really to collaborate. So let me start by asking Dr. Calderwood from MGH to speak first. Dr. Calderwood is the Morton Schwartz Academy Professor of Medicine, Microbiology and Molecular Genetics at Harvard Medical School, and he is the chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Mass General Hospital. So welcome. And if I could maybe just invite you, Steve, to give us a couple of introductory thoughts.
I think people are well aware of the problem of antimicrobial resistance, something that's been increasing over decades, of course, and now with hospital-acquired infections rising as we do more things in the hospital to people. We're increasingly in this situation where we don't have adequate antibiotics to treat people with serious infection. One estimate is that nearly 100,000 people might acquire such a hospital-acquired infection, and of the badly resistant organisms, I think everyone has heard of the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, or MRSA, and the attributable mortality to that in a year is probably as high as 20,000 deaths just from one pathogen. And I think people are also aware of the superbug, so-called, the gram-negative, that's multi-resistant, originally coming here from India and Pakistan. So it's clear that we have a major need for antibiotics, and yet antibiotic development has clearly been drying up for many reasons that hopefully we can get to. The Infectious Disease Society of America has put forward a proposal to try and get 10 new antimicrobial agents available for the resistant pathogens by the year 2020. And to reach that, it really will require a collaborative effort between clinicians, scientists, drug development, biotech, big pharma, and particularly government to help us get to that. So I really would help us hope that we could all look at this from the patient perspective. If all of us, of course we're also patients as well as our other lives, are lying in a hospital bed or as an outpatient with a serious infection, we'd like to have the choices available to us that would hopefully cure our infection.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Next, I'd like to invite just some introductory comments from Dr. Ronnie Farquar, who is with us today from Cubist Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Farquar has 25 years of experience in a very interesting mix of pharma, biotech, and CRO companies. So we're looking forward to his perspective.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for the opportunity to put forward the biotech perspective on this panel. So, certainly from biotech's perspective, the antibiotics business continues to offer exciting opportunities for investment, so long as the significant challenges, which we're going to come on and discuss in a few moments, are addressed. But before we actually get into a deep discussion of the challenges, I thought it may actually be worth just recapping on some of the positive reasons why a biotech such as Cubist continues to be very interested in the antibiotic space. I think first and foremost, and following on from Steve's comments, is the prospect to address unmet medical need. And at multiple levels, clearly from the point of view of motivation of our scientists, that's a big driver for many staff. I think clearly society, government, and increasingly regulatory authorities are showing acceptance of antibiotics' importance. And I think that in turn is driving increased willingness among stakeholders to collaborate. And we're seeing increased examples of that, such as GAIN Act and some collaboration among pharma and biotech companies that I'm sure we'll talk about earlier. I think another facet that I think makes the antibiotic area of interest is really the flip side of the significant scientific challenges associated with discovery and development of antibiotics. And that is for a biotech in particular, the opportunity for an innovator company to potentially radically change the way that this business is conducted. Other aspects I'll just touch on briefly are strong translational science that exists in the area. I think there are no other areas of drug discovery and medicine where you can have quite the predictive power in going from animal models of infection to being able to predict outcomes in patients. And that's clearly very important when you think on the cost of phase 3 failures and what that means for the industry. And also, and this is again bringing it back more to a biotech perspective, and has certainly been the Cubist experience, that products that address the most serious infections offer scope to be commercialized with a modest sized sales force. And that's clearly important when you're trying to build a business. So I know we're going to come on and talk about many of the challenges, but there remain some very exciting aspects of being in our business.
Thank you. Very interesting comments. Our third panelist is Dr. Munoz Perez, who leads the Infection Innovative Medicines and Small Molecules organization and serves as the site head for R&D in Boston at AstraZeneca. Welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the panel. I would like to build on Ronnie's comments on the opportunities, because who has never taken an antibiotic? And if you have not taken any yet, I'm sure that you will before too long. And it's great when they work. How many disease areas do you know where the medicine cures the disease completely within 4 days, 5 days at most? So when antibiotics work, they're wonder drugs. The challenge is, of course, that they develop resistance faster than we can develop new antibiotics to fight them. In the opportunity space, that's the opportunity. I'm here as a pharma scientist, but also as a patient. And as a scientist, period, I think we have taken our eye off the ball as a society, not as pharma, all of those components. But we can change that. The awareness is increasing, and the science is really challenging, but it can be tackled. For the last few decades, we had very, very effective drugs, and a number of them are still very effective. With new scientific advances in diagnostics, in particular, that will allow us to target treatments, new ways of conducting clinical trials that would allow us to once again develop antibiotics affordably and in non-geological timelines, I would say, but also new partnerships. I think R&D is an ecosystem. A pharma on its own, a biotech on its own, a hospital or an academic institute on their own cannot discover medicines. If you look at what happened in HIV/AIDS, for instance, in the last 2 decades, it's the partnership among all three that has led to the life-saving drugs we have today. I think that's the opportunity today that we all need to grasp.
Before we open it up for some questions from our audience, I'm going to take the liberty of asking 2 questions, if I may. We have talked a lot over the course of the last couple of days at the conference about how do we make innovation more efficient? How do we make it less expensive to introduce new treatments? And so now thinking specifically about infectious diseases, I know that regulatory issues are certainly a barrier, a hindrance, if you will, to efficiency, to cost effectiveness. I would love to hear your perspectives on what you think those regulatory issues are and any thoughts you have about how we would address them. And I'm going to open it up, please. Any of you, please feel free to offer your thoughts.
I think one of the issues from both the patient and the clinician perspective is the cost needed to pay for a new therapy. And that reflects, of course, the cost of development and clinical trials. These are medicines that are given for a short period of time as opposed to something you might take for a lifetime. And they also cost a large amount of money currently to develop. So the cost of a new antibiotic compared to an old one is sometimes as much as 50 to 100-fold higher. Most of the clinical trials that are currently done are powered to show non-inferiority to the existing treatment. just because of the cost to do a larger trial to show it's actually superior. So the medical community is left with two drugs that seem to be equivalent by the available data, and yet a 50-fold difference in cost. And so there's not a huge incentive to use them, even if they may have some advantage. So if we could get to a cost structure where doing actual trials that would show a benefit, and then include in the trials an economic analysis, not just of the cost of the drug, but the cost of reducing the length of hospitalization, reducing obviously mortality would be terrific, or any of the other consequences, then it would be a much easier economic analysis. So our focus has to be on how can we get you all to deliver drugs at a cheaper cost, recognizing you need the money to do the development. So that's a challenge.
Just to build on Steve's comments, I think one of the major challenges of our current development paradigm is the so-called disease or infection site aspect of how drugs have to be developed. So typically, for each infection site, 2 phase 3 trials of 1,000 or so patients. The challenge is, of course, that for an emerging pathogen, that's an extremely difficult and actually cost-prohibitive undertaking. And so we find ourselves in a situation that if we adhere strictly to the accepted regulatory development pathway, we actually have to wait until an epidemic is upon us before we can actually develop the drugs to deal with it. And clearly that has to be changed.
So the third angle perhaps on that is which patients can you enroll in your clinical trials? It is unethical, of course, to treat patients with a therapy that one knows is suboptimal, and the clinical trials that we need to run in antibiotics are not placebo-controlled, of course. They're controlled with a standard of care. So we need to enroll patients who are sensitive to the standard of care. The standard of care is very frequently an old antibiotic, which still works because the patients are responsive and is really cheap. And then you're developing your new antibiotic, which would benefit those patients who do not respond to the old antibiotic in the wrong patient population. And of course, it's comparatively better if you go to patients who would die if you treat them with the old antibiotic, but the patients who are responsive will show an equivalent benefit. And so you're running a non-inferiority trial. You're showing non-inferiority in patients who don't need the drug. But of course, the patients who do need the drug, your drug would be superior. Only it's not there in the regulatory filings. So I don't think there is an easy solution, but this is the problem.
Any thoughts, any other feedback on your colleagues' comments?
I would mention that the National Institutes of Health has announced the formation of a clinical trials network similar to the AIDS clinical trials network that was very successful in developing medicines for HIV. Unfortunately, it's not yet funded at the level that would be needed to make a similar major approach to this, but there may be opportunities then for all of us collaboratively think about what are the major questions that could be answered and should be answered to really do the research in a synergistic way to answer those questions that would have the largest impact on patients' lives. And I think that's really what the NIH is looking for, is a synergistic interaction around very defined questions that would have the biggest impact for the money spent. And I think the HIV network is the example that they're using.
So I think that's a great segue into my second question, and then we'll open it up. And that is, what are your thoughts on a collaborative process? Which stakeholders should be part of that? Who should play what roles? If we're talking about reducing barriers and promoting efficiency. And I think in the spirit of our earlier discussions here in the Massachusetts Pavilion, how do we step outside our individual interests and our comfort zones and really put the patient first in this?
Go ahead.
I think it's perhaps a truism that there's nothing like significant adversity to actually encourage collaboration and innovation that may not have happened otherwise. And I'm certainly encouraged by the fact that we're beginning to see evidence of such collaboration. So if you take the GAIN Act, which is progressing through Congress, that which Cubist actually was a major proponent of really building some momentum behind. That act really is, I think, a great representation of cross-partisan support and shows the ability to build a broad-based coalition. Over 50 organizations were involved in the creation and support of that, including charitable trusts, medical, American Medical Association, IDSA and others, and of course many companies also came together as well to actually pioneer and kind of push that forward. So that would probably have been an unthinkable endeavor certainly 5 or 10 years ago. And I think the fact that all those parties were able to collaborate to the extent they have, and for the bill to enjoy the bipartisan support it has as it's moved through the House and Senate, actually talks to the prospects for increased collaboration and cooperation.
Other thoughts on that?
I think it'll be really important for each of the partners in this synergy to define what they're best at and what role they could play in the partnership, and understand what they're not as good at, and make sure that the incentives for what they're good at are aligned. And the examples I guess I would give is I think academia is good at defining basic mechanisms, both of action and resistance, of identifying targets that might be relevant. We're not very good at then improving medicinal chemistry to actually figure out how to hit that target with a drug. We're not necessarily as good at some of the development steps that look at toxicity or pharmacology. We have some specialized animal models, but general animal models we certainly don't need to do. And then of course at the other end, we're an essential partner in clinical trials. So I think if we could figure out a way to move things through and have the right synergy where each piece of the pie has those roles that they can play uniquely, then it might be a more effective, and that of course happens already, but it might be the way to really structure it.
I would just like to add one point, building on your comments, Steve. There is something between academia and pharma, and that's biotech. This is crucially important. We innovate in pharma, of course, but the kind of innovation that biotech can do, taking really early ideas and troubleshooting, I think is unique. We don't have, I believe, anywhere near enough the volume of biotech investment, new ideas being tried out and failing for the majority, of course, for us to move the science in those new directions as effectively as that has been done in other therapy areas. I think it's something that we need to take care of as partners in facing that problem. But I think there is a place for investors to invest, because I think there are going to be takers, there are patients, and there is a medical need.
So let me invite the members of the audience to share your thoughts if you would like to add your input to some of the topics that we've discussed, or if you have questions for the panelists, please don't be shy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Kelvin Lam from Blue Sky Biotech from Mass, Worcester. My question is I was wondering what...
May we ask you, are you able to speak just a bit louder, even with the mic?
No
Thank
problem.
you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Great,
Yes,
thank you. My name is Kelvin Lam from Blue Sky, located in Worcester, Mass. My question is what strategy one should use between biotech, big pharma, and university tackling a disease like tuberculosis? Like a multi-drug resistance problem is enormous, especially the third world country. I was wondering, any thoughts on any of the panel member would be insightful. Thank you.
I can take that as a first stab. AstraZeneca, we have a group that has been working on tuberculosis inside our organization for about a decade now. And it's a lonely place. Very few groups do that in drug discovery. There's a lot of activity in academia and nothing to translate it. The challenge, of course, with tuberculosis approaches is that there is unlikely to be the type of financial return that an investor would want to get from a biotech investment. So what other mechanisms can you put in place? There are product development partnerships which fund work in academia quite generously at times. Could some of that investment be focused on translating those ideas into biotechs and have them flourish there? that perhaps is an answer. I would love there to be more substrate for us to work from and with.
If I could just follow on from that, just talking from personal experience, a previous company I worked within that Steve was actually also involved with, actually had some assets that were very interesting, in fact, to the TB Foundation. And we were approached by the foundation and actually made the assets available for testing there. I think the other thing that is definitely helping is with the migration of scientists from pharma and biotech into organizations such as TB Foundation. These are drug discovery savvy individuals, and then they can be very discriminating in what they ask for when they approach biotech companies, and then how they handle the assets when they're transferred. And I think that builds confidence as well.
Maybe I'll just comment. In academia, much of the work goes on in diseases that have such a large impact, even though the market for sale in the United States may not be as relevant. So tuberculosis is a major area of investigation, as of course are malaria and other diseases less common in this country. And I do think it's a good example of where there's a gap between what's potentially discovered as a target and then how to translate it, because there may not be an effective way to get it into a market. The Gates Foundation, of course, has played a major role there, as have other foundations, and I think public-private partnerships are another way to approach that. But I think you've identified an important gap. Some of the things that are discovered, of course, for tuberculosis have multiple uses, and so that may be another way to approach that.
Good question. Other questions? Comments on any of the topics that we've been talking about? Yes, thank you, sir. The question is, could the panel talk about personalized health care? Go ahead, please.
That's exactly the question. How will personal health care hopefully improve the fight against multiple diseases?
I assume by personalized health care, you're referring to genomic medicine and ascertainment of the risk. Yeah. Yeah. So obviously there are certain things that would be potentially predictable ahead of time. Unfortunately, we know a relatively small number of those at the moment. But adverse reactions may be a particularly important area. Obviously also drug pharmacology is affected a reasonable amount by genomics. So I think if we looked far enough ahead, I think that probably will be an important component of where we're at. But unfortunately, I don't see that in the near term as a solution in the next 5 or 10 years, perhaps, in my view.
I sincerely hope that you are wrong. I think the paradigm for antibiotic treatment indeed has been broad spectrum molecules that cover lots of bacteria, those that you're infected with and those that you're not, or maybe that are in your body but make no harm. And I think that empiric treatment, a physician sees a critically ill patient, has to take a guess on what the antibiotic might be that that patient will benefit from and give it right there and then, because they have 6 hours, maybe 12 hours to make the right choice. Drives resistance, which is the problem that we're all tackling. And it also, I think, reduces the benefit to the patient. Ultimately, a patient who's infected with a drug-sensitive strain of strep does not require a hard-hitting third-line antibiotic. So my hope is that we can develop rapid diagnostics which can help us focus the treatment to the patients who need it. So if a treating physician would know whether you're infected with a gram-negative drug-resistant strain and treat you with the right antibiotic rather than with a broad-spectrum gram-positive, gram-negative drug, I think we'll be in a much better place. Now, the challenge, of course, is technological, but technology starts getting there. And I hope that within 5 years, the challenge will be more on the treating physician's side of changing the practice and moving into this place where you have more targeted, more effective treatments for...
Maybe I misunderstood his question, but I thought he was actually referring to a different issue. personalized medicine is normally used to represent not what you're talking about, but for basically sequencing host genes and knowing adverse outcome or effectiveness. If we're talking about the latter, that is narrowing therapy, already they're existing at every hospital antimicrobial stewardship programs, which are programs that are trying to get people rapidly changed from the broad spectrum therapy to the narrow spectrum needed. They've been shown to be cost effective, improve quality and safety in major ways, and of course reduce overall costs and reinfection. The major missing piece is rapid diagnostic information to make that choice. And so I agree that's a very fertile area. And if that's the question, I agree, don't wait 5 or 10 years, we're doing it today.
May I ask a follow-on question, which is, so when you look at the need for this type of innovation, so let's say more progress in rapid diagnostics, and you look at the landscape in terms of funding, do you feel comfortable that the funding for this kind of innovation is there, that it will be there? Where will it, from whom will it come? Your thoughts about that?
If I can start there, I think the innovation there is probably going to come from some of the sequencing technologies and nucleic acid-based technologies, which are driving towards, the $1,000 human genome, and so it seems like the ability to rapidly sequence from blood samples and such like for pathogen identifications should be well within our means. So I think there's already significant momentum built in the technology community, and I think it's really a question of really harnessing many of the available technologies to build on the earlier comments on rapid diagnostics. Of course, the catch-22 here is the level of fidelity of the diagnosis that's being made, because as we all know, unfortunately, the wrong diagnosis could well be fatal for the patient.
So this is an area that the National Institutes of Health has started to invest in the basic science space. And I think one of the challenges is most of the technologies for diagnosis are being developed around blood samples, which are easy and generally sterile from other organisms. But most infections, or many infections, are at other body sites. And so how to in a non-invasive manner, figure out what's at a body site that you're not necessarily going to directly sample is not a small challenge. And I think that's an area that many people are working on, including in tuberculosis, as the question was asked, and other diseases. So I think that's one of the missing pieces. So blood diagnostics may not be so hard, but something in the lung, for example, unless you're going to do a more invasive procedure, it may be that you're not going to trust the result because you're actually not where the infection is.
I agree. The challenge will be to discriminate organisms that happen to be there from organisms that are causing the disease. But like Ronnie, I think that technologies are being developed for other areas perhaps which can be adapted. I think it's probably going to need to be a little bit more sophisticated than a blood test. It might require one to look at multiple parameters, perhaps some parameters that have to do with the pathogen and some others that have to do with the host response, to try and type that. We are looking for partners in that space. It's part of our strategy. We have colleagues all around bio, from personalized healthcare and infection. We have engaged discussions with our small companies that have ideas, but this is very much something that we will look to encourage and develop by working with them.
If I can just add, I think where there's some kind of breaking science that really crosses over from kind of pathogen identification back to the question of personalized medicine and kind of gene signatures is some of the emerging work around the microbiome, gut microbiome, skin microbiome and such like, where I think increasingly we're going to be seeing that individuals have quite distinct signatures of microbiome.
And what's the role for the public sector in this?
By public, you mean the patient, or public, the government?
Public sector from a funding perspective, as a partner, maybe,
yeah.
Given some of the specific needs that you've identified. I mean,
yeah.
what's the role that the public sector should play, the state should play, the federal?
So, I mean, one of the side effects or spin-offs of the anthrax attacks and the U.S. investment in biodefense was directed at this very issue. That is, how could you rapidly diagnose a subset of infections that people were worried about? And several technologies were brought to bear that are not necessarily only applicable to that subset of diseases. And so there's some very exciting early but promising studies that look at metabolites exhaled in breath, for example, or excreted in urine when an organism density is high enough to be highly suggestive of that particular infection. So that kind of very preliminary early discovery work, I think, is appropriately invested in by public financing. Once it's developed, obviously all the testing that would be needed to prove it's useful probably is beyond what the government would do, and that would require probably biotechnology partnership and then advancement through the system.
Other questions from the audience? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
On the role of public sector, I think there's a great example where perhaps Europe has done something that the US could look to not imitate, of course, but improve over. There was an announcement in the past month of an EU-driven initiative called New Drugs for Bad Bugs. It's a very catchy name, but it does describe what they do really clearly. There is some money going that way, so the European Union is contributing about 100 million euros, and the pharma partners through IMI about the same amount in kind contributions. But what that 100 million does is encourage cross-pharma collaborations, for instance, in sharing data on failed targets, sharing methodology development approaches, but also partnerships between pharma, biotech, and academia, informing consortia around programs, managing costs, but also accelerating timelines, improving the way in which we discover those. So if you think about it, 100 million is not a lot of money for achieving all of that. And I think more initiatives such as this one could really help.
Just to add to Manos's comments, so one facet of the collaboration he alludes to is something I think that can only be really tackled properly through a consortium with public funding and kind of staying power there. And that's around the issue of efflux, particularly in gram-negative multi-drug resistant bacteria, where, you know, I think all of us who've worked in the gram-negative antibiotic discovery space know that while we have good tools to take us to nanomolar or sub-nanomolar IC50 potency compounds against enzymes, actually going up against an intact microorganism is a completely different matter. And really, you know, trying to define rigorously some of the rules that are governing efflux, it's very difficult for any single company to do. And I think this is the kind of thing that public funding can help with.
Other questions from the audience? Yes. So thank you.
Hi, Quentin Zondervan from Excel Immune. We work on cloning human antibodies against infectious disease agents, and as part of that work, we have need for medical collaborators, specifically doctors who are actively seeing patients. And of course, we understand the doctors are very busy, but we do find it difficult to set up those collaborations. So since this is about a collaborative effort, what could we do collectively to make it easier for innovators in biotech and pharma to set up those kind of collaborations to develop new drugs?
That's a great question. I look forward to the answers of the panel.
So my hope is that the National Institutes of Health announced creation of a drug-resistant clinical trials network might help address what you're describing. And it would use exactly the same model that the HIV network has used. There would be a group of people at the national level who would decide what are the most important issues to be addressed and what are the most promising things to address them with, and how should a trial be designed that would convince everyone it's an improvement. And then there'd be a partnership with whatever people have such a product available. The test would actually largely be run at the government's expense, although the drug would be provided, as I understand it, by the provider of that compound. All the details of that aren't yet announced, but I think that may be a very important step forward, and one we've lobbied for probably more than a decade. So a very exciting development.
I think that would also really call on the need for really thorough microbiological evaluation of the infection, such that it became clear that the infection couldn't be treated by existing antibiotics. So I presume you're actually looking to innovate with products that can treat otherwise untreatable infections. So I think having acceptable tools whereby patients who are in that situation can be flagged for companies like yourself to put treatments forward.
Is that a partnering opportunity for big pharma or larger biotech companies and very small companies? Any way to provide access to providers? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think it's probably not, the network hasn't yet been formally announced or competed for, but yes, I think when it's available, and I really think that we can use the HIV example as a good model of how that worked, and we went over a period of 30 years, as people know, from very few drugs to now standard of care therapy being life-saving for most people. So if we could put the same amount of effort and time into this problem, I think we could solve it. But it will take all partners, and that has to include, of course, patients. So people really need to be informed, why is clinical research important? Why would your participating in this trial, both for yourself and for others, be useful to answer a question? The community infected with HIV was very forthright in participating in that. In fact, drove many of the trials. And so I hope that patients, when they have acute infections, would be similarly motivated.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, here's one. Thank you.
I have sort of a general question. So antibiotic development is never going to be very profitable.
Thank you.
Developing antibiotics is never going to be very profitable. I mean, compared to cancer drugs or any sort of chronic disease. And I'm wondering what you think can be done to encourage new companies to get into this area, because it seems like every startup I hear about is working on cancer or inflammation or something that's considered much more profitable, but certainly not as, antibiotics are never going to be lucrative as that. Is it a question of spreading out the costs or regulatory reform, or what do you think needs to be done to encourage more companies to go into it?
I can make a start on that. First of all, I do believe that antibiotic drug discovery and development can be profitable. If you look at some of the best-selling antibiotics, they do return rather more money than was invested and necessary to develop them. The challenge is how you use them and how quickly they become profitable. And I think perhaps my answer earlier to the personalized healthcare question could be part of the solution. So nowadays, antibiotics are developed which are very powerful, very active against resistant infections, but through stewardship programs, they are put on the shelf for 4, 5, 6 years, patent life drains out, and all your investment stagnates while you're waiting for your emerging resistant strain to become more than emerging. So the solution could be, like we do in cancer, and you raised that example, if you have a diagnostic that tells you this patient can only be treated with this antibiotic, I see no reason why you would not be able to charge a premium price, because that's the drug that the patient needs, not a generic old antibiotic. And like in cancer, of course, it's not going to be a chronic treatment, but many cancer patients are treated for 3 months. The life expectancy is increased by 6 months, by a year, maybe sometimes. Those antibiotics save your life. You treat it for a week or 2 weeks, and you prolong your life by decades. So I do believe that there can be an argument made for profitable antibiotics, but not necessarily in the paradigm that we have been working in for the last decades.
Just to build on Manos's comments, I think based on the success of the Orphan Drug Act, I think we should expect that the GAIN Act, if passed, by providing 5 years of additional exclusivity for qualified infectious disease products, would actually be a powerful economic incentive for companies to remain in the area or to come back into the area of antibiotic development. I think the other thing that Manos has alluded to, and Steve earlier, is really trying to find a path forward for narrow spectrum agents. Because typically in the course of a discovery program, it's much easier to find a narrow spectrum agent than a broad spectrum one. And so I think the combination of those two would certainly be helpful.
I mentioned that there was an email yesterday that suggests that legislation along the lines you've described is nearing passage, hopefully this week in Congress. So we may, by the end of the week, actually have some substantial progress made in some of the areas you've just described.
Bob, would you like to start transitioning now? We can certainly hear. So would you like to begin to move into the next event? Okay. So I will forego my last question, which was to ask you what your thoughts were about whether we really are facing a pre-antibiotic future. But I want to thank all of you very. Yes. 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 No.
No, I am very confident.
No.
Yes. We can.
Yes.
Yeah, we can be successful.
I think we need to address the challenges we've talked about.
So to be continued. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much to the panelists. This was a really very provocative discussion. Thanks so much.